Good evening, everyone. I'm David Cohen, and I want to, on behalf of Politics and Prose, welcome Elizabeth Drew to the celebration of the publication of her book, Washington Journal, Reporting Watergate and Nixon's Downfall. This is Elizabeth's 15th book, and she has presented at Politics and Prose for every one of her books since we opened. So this is her 10th presentation, and it's safe to say you hold the record. 2014 is a year of anniversaries, beginning with the start of World War I. Each merits commemoration and reflection. Today is the 60th anniversary of the Brown versus Board of Education decision, when Chief Justice Warren wrote, "Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal." In June and July, we'll commemorate the 50th anniversary of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And who can forget the 40th anniversary of President Nixon's impeachment and resignation? Elizabeth Drew's writings in her various books and in her many articles in the New York Review of Books, the New Yorker, Rolling Stone, the Atlantic, really touch on all these three anniversaries. Even recently in the New York Review, she had a marvelous piece about the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the play in New York with Bryan Cranston called All the Way, which is about Lyndon Johnson. Elizabeth Drew helps us understand the significance of the anniversaries, what lessons have been learned and applied, and what they mean for how we govern ourselves. Elizabeth Drew gives us a complex and understandable picture of the layers and passageways we have to navigate, and does it with lots of insight. In these anniversaries, we are well beyond a people to deal, as a people, we always struggle to deal with our penchant for historic amnesia. Our challenge is not the meaning of grievance or bitterness, but how do we help memory serve facing our current problems today and not denying their existence? What Elizabeth Drew has done with Washington Journal is provide us with new and astonishing material on Richard Nixon in the post-presidency, on the part of his life that has not been examined in this period of the post-presidency. Elizabeth Drew's Watergate stories stays riveting and fresh when she first wrote it. And as many of you read it then, and I read it then, and I can tell you it is fresh and riveting. The original reporting, the fresh analysis, comes with a historic sense and sensibility that probes and explains and connects free-floating data and dots. Elizabeth Drew stays fresh and vital. She takes on new subjects. By their testimony, in a very competitive world, some of her colleague journalists talked about how she has inspired them, younger journalists, and it's one of the reasons it's important to keep this book alive. So in the words of the old Hebrew song, "From generation to generation," let us now welcome Elizabeth Drew to Politics and Prose.
Thank you, David. Why don't you just keep talking and I'll sit and drink in your words. They were lovely. It's lovely to be back here. First time since my last book, as David got across. Carla and Barbara were always very welcoming to me. And I have to tell you, publishers and authors scratch and crawl and do all sorts of things to be able to speak at this marvelous place. But they always said, "When's your next book? You're on." and it was lovely. And as David said, Brad and Lissa have carried on the wondrous tradition that Carla began, the energy and the ingenuity, and may it keep going. The fact that all of you have come tonight is a testimony to the job they do and the reverence for books that we all share. Richard Nixon's a hard man to let go of. I remember as a child in black and white fuzzy television seeing this odd man. He was on the ticket with General Eisenhower, and there was some problem of his taking some money from a secret fund. He was talking about his daughter's dog, and I thought, he's interesting. Well, he never stopped being interesting. Richard Nixon was never boring. And as David mentioned, he was probably as interesting in his after presidency as he was during his presidency. I chronicle in the book the beginning with Spiro Agnew. Remember Spiro Agnew being in some trouble. And I had said to my editor at the New Yorker, the very lamented and very justly legendary William Shawn, had said to me, "So what are you thinking of writing next?" And I said, "Well, I don't know. I just have this feeling that we're going to change vice presidents and presidents within a year." This was Labor Day of '73. It was a very way out there, kind of wild thought at the time. And so we agreed I would write a journal, not a diary, but watch the events and interpret them and talk about them. And we didn't know where it was going. And as he said at the time, we don't know how to change vice presidents, because that would be the first order of business. We didn't know how to do anything. We didn't know how to change vice presidents. We didn't know how to impeach a president. We didn't know how to get another president. It was all kind of made up as we went along. And one of the most distressing things about now is the loose way in which this word impeachment is tossed around. And I may or may not get to this later because I have so much to talk about. But if there is such a thing, the way that Richard Nixon was almost impeached was really the model. It came from the center. It was bipartisan. It was, the country could accept it because it was arrived at in a very fair and methodical way. So Richard Nixon had no choice, finally, but to resign. He held out and he held out, but mainly Republican senators went to see him. They didn't want to conduct a trial. They just wanted to get this thing over with, and they wanted Jerry Ford in there before the election. So we had this iconic Nixon goodbye as he got onto the helicopter to take him to the plane to go to San Clemente, his western White House, where he would retire and never be heard from again. So we thought, well, that's not my Nixon. He was, when he got to California, he was understandably deeply, deeply depressed. He had worked for decades to get to this highest place that he possibly could, than anybody in this country possibly can, in this country politically, and it all gone smash. He kind of knew in his own head he'd done a fair amount to bring it on. But he always believed that people were out to get him. This was what really brought about his downfall. He could not distinguish between opponents and enemies. And this became a big problem for him. But he was depressed. He was not well. He had phlebitis from a trip to the Middle East that he took toward the end. But he was not going to give up. He had never given up all his life. He'd always seen himself as being treated as lesser and lower than others. He was poor. His family was, let's say just dysfunctional was not a word then, but this was a really dysfunctional family. But usually they don't grow up to tear up the Constitution. But he had been looked down as a kid. He was awkward. He read a lot. He was not popular. He never really had friends. Strange kind of person to go into politics, but he was just so determined about everything. So he was determined this was not going to be the end of Richard Nixon. No. He was going to work his way back into respectability. Now imagine, this was a situation which would have crushed most people. And yet he was determined. So he drew up a plan. They always had a plan Number of aides were sent out to California with him at the government expense, and they drew up a plan called Wizard. And this was to be the resurgence and reemergence of Richard Nixon as a statesman. Now, he was smart enough to know that how do you get to be a statesman? Well, people listen to you. They're going to listen to you on foreign policy, not on, frankly, I'm sorry, education or environment or these things. And also, those issues bored him anyway. His great triumphs were détente with the Soviet Union and the opening to China. China was really the one dearest to his heart. So he began to make speeches. He began to take trips. He went to China and he issued pronouncements as if he were still president, or he thought he was. He would, our Nixon never quite, he didn't change though. He would write a secret memorandum to the president on his trip or on some issue, and then he, of course, leak it to the press, and it would be in the papers. And he had the interviews, the famous interviews with David Frost, which were not as portrayed in Frost-Nixon. You can look it up. I take that apart pretty well. He did not confess. They just left out a few words that were inconvenient to the story. He then began to get bored in San Clemente, moved to New York, where he'd been before, after he'd lost the California governorship, after he'd lost the presidency in 1960, when everybody thought, oh, he's gone. But he's never gone. I wish he were back now, because he was so much fun. And so interesting. In any event, he moved to New York, and he and Pat Nixon, she was thrilled to be out of politics at last. She hated it. And they bought a brownstone. They were vetoed at various co-ops, of course. And he decided he would have a series of dinners with the poobahs of New York, publishers, bankers, the Council on Foreign Relations, whatever, almost all stag. Well, these dinners I discovered this was just in the last few years. I discovered this post-presidency, which I found as interesting as the presidency. So he would have these dinners, and everything was clockwork. At 7:00, he met people in the car at the front door. They went upstairs. He mixed drinks. He really prided himself on the dry martinis that he made. Now, this was not a man who was very good at small talk, but they chatted away. He had a house, and the subtlety was not his long suit. The house was done up in Chinese decor. The appetizers were Chinese. The waiters were Chinese. The dinner was Chinese. And then after dinner, they would go upstairs, and there was an organized subject at the dinner, and then afterwards they would go upstairs, and there would be some more chat. And Nixon, that card, he would look up at 10:30. He'd look up at a clock, and he'd say, "Oh, it's 10:30, and I promised I would get David Cohen to a house of prostitution by 11, so we have to stop now." And everybody knew to leave. But the word of these dinners went all over New York, and everybody wanted to come. He became a celebrity. After a while, he thought New York he didn't like the atmosphere for his grandchildren, on whom he doted. And so he moved to Saddle River, New Jersey. But he wasn't finished. There was another generation to cultivate. So he had a series of dinners in Saddle River where he would Roger Stone, you may have read about, but he was his operative for this. They invited journalists too young to have been of age during Watergate. Nobody who knew about Watergate was to be around. And he could be very impressive. He spoke just with a microphone, not even a note, and he was kind of name-droppy about foreign leaders I have known, but everybody was very impressed. And so, in the end, he won on his own terms. He had a funeral he would have loved. The extant president came. 3 ex-presidents came. Henry Kissinger, sort of choked as he gave his little talk. Bob Dole had a tear coming down his eye. Now, Bob Dole, while Nixon was president, during all the trouble, had been asked, would you like him to make an appearance in Kansas and Dole had said a flyover would do. So my Nixon would have seen straight through these guys. He knew that Kissinger was bad-mouthing him up with his friends in Cambridge and at the Georgetown parties. He understood everything that was going on. He was onto them. But he would have been mighty pleased with his funeral. And I have to say, I kind of miss him, but he was so interesting. Now, why did I write this journal in the first place? When I spoke to Mr. Sean about, we had this idea for keeping the journal at the time, as I said, we didn't know where it was going, and I came back to Washington. And this is also why we're here again. My mentor at the time, he also happened to have been David's, John Gardner, said to me, Elizabeth, took him a while, Elizabeth, write it so that 40 years from now, people will know what it was like then. It cannot be recaptured. Now, I don't know that I wrote it any differently with that in mind. I didn't know where or whether I would be in 40 years. It just happens that it's 40 years from now. This is not an anniversary book. Frankly, the book was out of print. And I wrote to Peter Mayer of Overlook Press, whom I knew had a very distinguished book list. And he wrote back and said, it's idiotic for that book to be out of print. Yes, we're going to reissue it in hardback. Well, my heart leapt, needless to say. And then I said, well, I'll write a little afterward to clear things up. And there came the afterward, which is a 10,000-word edition of all new materials, part of which I've told you. But I also look back on what was Watergate? What was it really? With all due respect, it wasn't two reporters doing outstanding reporting. That wasn't it. It wasn't petty crimes or a break-in. The break-in that was caught, by the way, I learned this as I was doing my reporting many years later. It was actually the fourth attempt of these burglars to get in the Watergate. The first time they planned a grand dinner inside the Watergate, and that would get them in the building, and they could get up to the Democratic National Headquarters. There was just one thing, I don't know, one thing led to another. They ended up locked in a closet that night. The next time they went up and they got there, but they didn't need equipment to pick the lock. So one of the burglars, Mr. Martinez, went back to Miami to get a good lock pick. And they came back and they went in, and they actually got in over the Memorial Day weekend, over the Labor Day weekend. No, the Memorial Day weekend that summer. But as is often the case, pardon my English, they screwed up. And they put the tap on the wrong phone, and they took the pictures. The pictures were all blurred. And one of the burglars took us to John Mitchell, our former Attorney General, who was then head of the committee to re-elect the president, otherwise known as CREEP. And Mitchell, as reported, said, these stink. I doubt that that's the word he used, but that's it. Go back and get better pictures and fix the tap. Then they went in and they were caught. So think about Watergate. Think about this. We had a White House where the president came in with a lot of hate, a lot of people he hated, and a lot of people whom he assumed were enemies. So he, on his wish, they hired this bunch of strange people who... a former cop from New York named Anthony Ulazowitz, whose first job was to tail Ted Kennedy because Nixon thought Ted Kennedy would be his opponent in 1972. And so he wanted to get the goods on him. He was always wanting to get the goods on people. The main person he wanted to get the goods on, of course, was Dan Ellsberg, who had leaked the Pentagon Papers. Now, Kissinger was very worked up about this, too, and had got Nixon all worked up. And there was actually then committed probably the most dangerous, and Nixon understood this. He was far more concerned about the following having been found out than the Watergate break-in. And that is the burglars, the plumbers, they were plumbing for leaks, it was said. They went out to California and they raided the office of Dan Ellsberg's psychiatrist to get his psychiatric files. Now imagine that. A White House sending somebody out to examine somebody's psychiatric files. There was just one problem. Though they had cased it, there were no files. They broke in okay, and they had their picture taken. Two of them, Hunt and Liddy, the leaders, had their picture taken, and they were so proud in front of the doctor's office door. And they were using CIA equipment, cameras, voice changers, wigs. And so the CIA got these pictures and said, "What's this? This is a violation of Fourth Amendment beyond anything we could imagine." That's what that's what the cover-up was really about. Fortunately for the country, the plumbers were stumblebums. They messed up everything they did, or we'd have been in far deeper trouble. Living through Watergate, it was just an amazing time. Things were coming at you all the time. Now, fortunately, with all due respect, we didn't have cable, or it would have been total chaos. But we had the morning paper, we had the radio with an occasional bulletin, and we had the evening papers and the evening news. And that was it. Otherwise, we had the gossip. We had the, "Have you heard? My God, have you heard this? You won't believe what we just heard." And it was just like that all the time. There was the famous Saturday night. It was called the Saturday Night Massacre, and I refused to call it that. I was actually on a television program at the time, and we were sitting there. It was like being in a banana republic. The bulletins kept coming in. The president has ordered the Attorney General Richardson to fire Archibald Cox, who was demanding that the president turn over the tapes. Richardson has refused, and he's been fired. Next up, Bill Ruckelshaus was the deputy attorney general. He refused. He was fired. This went on through the night, and the bulletins were coming in, and it was Banana Republic time, or downtown Santiago. Somebody else said it was very disturbing. We didn't know where we were. The FBI surrounded the headquarters of the independent counsel's office. This kind of stuff. And so you just never knew what was coming next. I did a reflection on this later about what kind of people were these, and how did this happen? And I'd say we didn't have time to even think about that then. I tried to, and I have various reflections through the book about what are we to draw from this, and what kind of country is this, and how could this be? And I said, there's too much going on to think these things through. We're absorbing, one after another, events that outrun our imaginations, and trying to prepare ourselves for months of bitter struggle to come. Someone close to the administration has said to me that the story of the Nixon administration is one of people who were in over their heads. There may be something to that, but that does not explain it. There was a fanatic quality to some of the Nixon men, a weaving together of their public piety and their venom, which may have deceived even them. And one cannot escape the thought that the president set the tone. My feeling throughout this is, and you can look at many situations and say, well, you don't have to know who knew what when, who set the tone, how did this come about? One cannot escape the thought that the president set the tone, lonely and suspicious, a man with a striking lack of deep human connections. He seems to have gone through life as if in constant combat. He confused legitimate opposition with vendetta, and so did his staff. Most of us have what a friend of mine calls an inner jury, people whose judgment we trust and whose esteem matters to us, and whom we count on to level with us. Nixon does not seem to have an inner jury. He was also he was very interesting, but he was very strange. And just to give you the flavor of what it was like to try to follow Nixon and see what he's trying to tell us, there was a rather famous event where he spoke in Orlando to a group of editors. And just to give you the sense of the language of this man, David, you tell me when it's time to pull the plug, okay? We were in the disclosure stage, and we had learned that the break-in was June 17th, and Nixon came back from Florida, where he also had a place in the Keys in Key Biscayne, near his one friend, B.B. Rebozo. And he came back and he had meetings that day with Haldeman and with Colson. And we know that he called John Mitchell. But this is when the cover-up began. But we didn't quite know that then because the tapes hadn't come out yet. The transcripts didn't come out till later that summer. That told us a lot, but there was still more to come, and there was still more that, I learned in the last couple of years. Tonight, the president disclosed that he did call John Mitchell on June 20th, 1972, in order to cheer him up after the men were caught in the Watergate. He goes on in detail why a tape ran out. Suddenly, we discovered there were 18 and a half minutes missing on a tape. And so they tried to pin it on his secretary, Rosemary Woods, and she was in court and trying to act out how she was answering the phone and, putting her foot on the pedal, but it didn't work. She couldn't do it. And, in the end, it was Nixon sitting at Camp David, running the machine and erasing 18 and a half minutes from that day, from the cover-up conversation with Haldeman. That's not anywhere except in when I put it all together later. He goes into detail about why a tape ran out, and we're further and further from the point. He explains that his taping system was a little Sony, these little Sonys that they had. And there are these little lapel mics on my desk. He said he rubbed a little flag in his lapel. It was Nixon who started the business of the flags in the lapel. And I remember John Garner saying, we should all wear the flag pins. We should all put the flag decals on our cars. Don't let them take it from us. But the Dems and the liberals weren't that smart, and so they have appropriated that symbol to this day. So he rubs the flag in his lapel, and he says with a smile, the equipment President Johnson had was incidentally much better material. There had been reports that Kennedy and Johnson had the phones. He adds, I'm not criticizing Sony's, you see. Far be it from me to do a thing like that. That would be wrong. That's the kind of way he would talk. An editor asked him his reaction to the discovery of the tapes, the conversations with Dean and Mitchell didn't exist, and the president replies that it was one of the great disappointments because I wanted the evidence out. He said that the plumbers were established to stop leaks of information that were endangering national security, in one so serious that even Senator Ervin and Senator Baker agreed it should not be disclosed. Asked now, what were the Pentagon Papers? They were a critique of the Johnson administration management of the Vietnam War. But, of course, it raised questions about the Vietnam War, which they continued, Nixon and Kissinger continued for 5 years, and in the end got about the same deal that they could have had when they first came in. But don't ask Kissinger about it or be prepared to sit for quite a while. As he explains, that's not the case. Asked how Watergate could happen, the president replies, 72 was a very busy year. Arguing that measures had been taken to hold down the consumption of fuel on his trip to the South, he was in Disney World, which was fitting. And he said the backup plane hadn't been brought down, so they hadn't used up as much fuel. We did have a fuel crisis at the time. He adds that if his own plane goes down, this is the president talking, if it goes out, quote, it goes down, then they don't have to impeach me. And he talks about his vice presidential papers, which he had held out from the government, and his finances. Then he said this, I want to say this to the television audience. I made my mistakes, but in all of my years in public life, I have never profited from public service. I have earned every cent. Questionable. And in all my years of public life, I have never obstructed justice. Then came the famous immortal line. He said that he welcomes this kind of examination because people have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I am not a crook. Now, this is the President of the United States. Remember dignity? It was a period when it was funny. We were laughing in the same way. It was scary. We didn't know some people's phones were tapped. Some journalists' phones were tapped. A friend of mine is the wife of a columnist, and she learned that her very intimate conversations with her very close friend, who was Ted Kennedy's wife, were being listened to, at the Justice Department or in the White House. This was not funny. A friend of mine went out in the front lawn one Sunday morning, and the paper hadn't come, and she said, they've stopped the papers. Nothing became preposterous because it was all So preposterous, but also scary. The president suggested to some aides that they blow up the Brookings Institution because he believed, and he was told by these ace plumbers, that some papers left over from the Pentagon Papers were still in the office of Les Gelb and Mort Halperin, and they should set a fire and in the confusions go in there and get those papers. President is suggesting they blow up the Brookings Institution. Well, there was somebody on the staff who had the sense to stop it, but that was rare. So you also had what I learned later. You had a president who, frankly, was drunk a lot of the time. He was a very heavy drinker, and he slurred his words. And he was also on a medication called Dilantin, which was really for convulsion. It was not meant for depression, but somebody had given it to him for depression. Dilantin enhances the effects of alcoholism. So he would pick up the phone at 3 a.m. and call David Cohen. Cohen, this is the president. Fire everybody on the 6th floor of the State Department. This is an order. Slam. And then call him back and say, this is the president calling again. That order is not repealable. Slam. Appealable. Slam. Now, it was up to people like Haldeman and Ehrlichman and Colson and Dean and such folks to decide whether or not to carry out his orders. This was a scary thing. We didn't know it at the time, so we learned a lot later. As I told you, I have a passion about the subject of impeachment. It is thrown around so easily now, and it is very, very dangerous. It's a very serious business, and serious people went about it seriously. And he would have been impeached by the House, but some people were so afraid. He still had a following. He was not an easily dismissed figure. It might seem so now, but he had a substantial following, and Republicans were very torn. They wanted him out of there, just wanted him to go away. But they also didn't want the followers to be coming at them when they were up for re-election. So they were saying, where's the smoking gun? Now, I happen to hate the concept of a smoking gun because that makes it too simple. That simplifies it. It was a whole array of things. But this one tape was found that showed him ordering an obstruction of justice. And that gave the Republican senators the excuse to go down the White House and say, you've got to go, because they didn't want to deal with it any longer. What is the moral of the story? The moral of the story is watch out. We had several occasions on which during the interregnum, distinguished journalists would go to see him where he was living in California saying, oh, there's a new Nixon. No, there wasn't. Read these stories with some care. We had some reforms that stayed with us, some that didn't, but at least it got campaign finance on the agenda. Many other things that Mr. Cohen himself here was involved in. I have a passion for this subject. I wanted to keep the book alive. I hope you will want your children to read about it. We have generations who have no idea what happened in this extraordinary time when the Constitution was truly at stake. And I hope everybody, if you've read it before, you'll enjoy it again. I found myself shrieking and laughing as I read it again. And I hope I've made some little contribution to history and to your children's understanding of our history. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. As we said, from generation to generation. So this is perfect for lots of reasons. We're going to begin the question period. So just go to the microphone. Feel comfortable. If you feel comfortable, say your name. It's a public meeting. And Elizabeth will begin to answer your questions.
Don't be shy. Tom Hughes, don't you have a question? You always have a question. You're a great questioning person.
Here, you got one coming.
Okay, sir.
My name is Gregory Gums. I'm not from America. I'm from the Caribbean, so I'm from a different part of the world. This raises a whole set of questions. The most important is, do you believe, based on your own experiences, that what happened to Nixon. I mean, with Ronald Reagan, Iran affair, there was talk to basically potentially also impeach him, right?
You mean Iran-Contra?
I mean, Iran-Contra affair,
Yeah,
obviously.
I'll get to that. Okay, good question.
But you said that it was too dangerous to do it at that time. But it's an important question here, a constitutional question, in my opinion. Do you believe that Watergate might potentially show, that there are problems with the U.S. Constitution, that maybe there's too much power within the office of the president, and that if you have people there surrounding the president, that things can quickly get out of control in comparison with a parliamentary system where under certain conditions the prime minister has much more control. So I was wondering maybe if you thought about that and what you feel about it.
Thought about it a lot, and I wrote about it in this book too. The founding fathers were pretty smart men, but there was a lot they couldn't anticipate. And they certainly didn't spell out what they meant by impeachment. They said high crimes and misdemeanors. And I just want to add here that a lot of time was spent discussing what did James Madison mean. And it was really a kind of heady constitutional discussion that went on. Iran-Contra, you're right. I actually broadcast those with Judy Woodruff on PBS. And they made the decision that the country had just been through an impeachment and you shouldn't do one again. But I have to say, I think there's a gigantic difference. Iran-Contra was a very serious problem. It was an off-the-books operation that went against a congressional law. Watergate was a series of events. It was across the board. I'm often asked, and I'm expecting it, so I'll answer it anyway, what about now? This is nothing. We've had nothing remotely like it, where the president himself condoned these, not just criminal activities, but to set this whole atmosphere of fear and vengeance and enemies. And there was nothing like it. I pray there will be nothing like it. I think, no, we just have to be sure to hold the president accountable and get after the Congress if they're not doing so. Also get after them if they're going crazy on one particular issue. I won't even have to mention, because they're so looking for corruption and they just sort of can't find it. So it should balance out, and in the end, it did balance out there. The Constitution worked. Barely, but it worked. And I can't think of a better system, and I'm also very concerned about ideas for tinkering with the Constitution and the First Amendment. That's a whole nother subject. Anybody can play, and you don't want to start playing politics with the First Amendment or any of it.
Hi, my name is Richard. Do you think there was any truth to the thought when Nixon had phlebitis that he was sort of not taking his own life, but not necessarily fighting to live?
No, I don't think, you all heard the question? No, I don't think so. Nixon was not a quitter. I actually had the final section with a quote of his that quite struck me. A man isn't finished when he's defeated. He's finished when he quits. And I am not a quitter. And he never quit. He was as down and out as a person could be when he landed in San Clemente. Imagine the shame and the horror of being driven out of office. But he didn't quit. And for that, I have some admiration for that. It would have crushed most people, but he just kept going. Yes, ma'am.
My name's Eleanor Backrack. I've thought a lot, as you say, Watergate did show that the Constitution would be upheld, but I also feel that Watergate, and probably coming after the Vietnam War also, or during the end of it, really kind of robbed us of respect for our institutions, which I think has been a very long-running thing. It may have opened the door for the problem is the government ideas that have been floated ever since.
Have been what ever since?
Floated. I said, in other words, well, Ronald Reagan and the current the Republican Party.
Well, that's a long way from there to here. And in fact, Richard Nixon was probably the last Republican president who believed that government could do good things. He was no liberal. He was a centrist kind of by circumstance. He leaned to the conservative side, but he had a Democratic Congress who was very strong on environment and strong on a number of issues, and so he compromised. And a lot got done domestically, although it bored him to tears, and he wasn't really interested. No, I think you can take Watergate as you want to see it, but you can also see it as, well, the institutions worked. It in the end, this man and this government had gone so astray. To me, the most important, there were 3 articles of impeachment. The first one was obstruction of justice, which was a procedural thing, very serious. The second was abuse of power, and to me, that's really where the story was, and should be today in certain circumstances. Not here, but maybe in certain states, I don't know, I would want to say. But that under the administration of this person, these things went on, and they listed them. They were very, very careful about what they put in this abuse of power. I think we're going to be able to recognize it when we see it. And so it didn't discourage me. I didn't think it was the triumph that everybody else was saying, because we almost didn't get it done and dispose of it in the way that it should have been. Now, I always thought that Jerry Ford did the right thing in pardoning Nixon. That as he said, enough of Watergate is enough wallowing in Watergate, I think he put it, and the country had to move on. And I agreed with that. Can you imagine if we'd had years of a Nixon trial? My heavens, we would have been able to think of, pay attention to very little else. Now, a very distinguished judicial friend who says, no, that's wrong. He should have been held to judicial account. And we could go on that way, and everybody can have their opinions. I think it worked out kind of the way it should. A lot of his people went to jail. Most of them went to jail. And you see these parade of, Haldeman, Ehrlichman, Mitchell, Colson. They all went to jail. So there was an accountability that went on.
Hi, my name is Ted. My name is Ted Covey, and I was a college student back and can still remember watching President Nixon when he resigned. I've read quite a few books on Watergate, and I guess what I want to ask you as an author of one of those books, is there anything still we don't know about Watergate? Anything that you think still needs to be answered that hasn't come out?
I don't think so. Because I think in the end, it wasn't the little bitty details. I could get arrested for this, but I didn't really care who Deep Throat was. What's the difference? The story was what Nixon and the White House were doing. I mean, it was a little intrigue of who was leaking to these very, very hardworking and very smart, good reporters. But no. There's nothing that I'm curious about, that there's some little detail I don't know. I think we have enough to really understand it. And I hope that's what this book does, is it follows the events, but it also reflects on them as they're happening. And then in the afterward, I go back to what was Watergate, who was Richard Nixon, and I think I've got him at last. People say what a complicated, very complicated person he was, and he was. But he was fascinating. I didn't know Abraham Lincoln, so I think he's the most fascinating president that I know of, and an extraordinary, story. So no, there's nothing. I'm not a conspiracy type anyway. I think we've got the big picture, and that's the important picture.
Mr. Drew, my name is Jack Calkins. In Chris Buckley's wonderful phrase, I'm a self-loathing Republican.
You don't have to be.
And it happens that
Not
I was running
everybody
the
is.
House Campaign Committee, the NRCC, all during the Watergate trauma and so forth. And therefore I was in a very tense position. But I am taking this microphone for 2 reasons. One is to compliment you. I think you have dealt evenly with President Nixon.
Thank you.
He was an extremely complicated man. A wonderful intellect, by the way. I admired his
smart. He was a
mind
smart man.
tremendously, but he had a character flaw we all have to admit. The second thing is, I had a lot of differences with Bob Haldeman. I hated his goddamn guts. But I'm convinced that he was the man who stopped those idiotic, crazy presidential vocal orders more than anyone else.
We
And
don't
I think
know.
he gets credit for that.
just
He
don't
did what a
know.
good chief of staff should do. He disregarded his boss's orders when necessary.
Well, you know
Thank you.
may know more about that than I do. I've not seen recorded anywhere who stopped. Well, not a lot was stopped, after all. Some of the middle of the night calls, I think, where they'd get together and say, "No, what do we do now? You know, it's the boss again." But except for the Brookings order, I don't know of any during that period that were stopped. There was this supposedly, not supposedly, actually horrible plan that was drawn up early called Gemstone. And even J. Edgar Hoover, no great civil libertarian, thought that this was a bit much and that he would not implement it. But bit by bit, it was implemented. So there weren't a lot of governors or people who understood boundaries around the place. Mr. Flug.
Hi, Liz. As you know, I'm, like you, a Watergate junkie, and there are a lot of us around. I agree with you that it wasn't destined that Nixon get caught and taken out of office. It might not have happened but for a series of lucky happenstances and having the right people in the right place at the right time. So I agree with you on a lot.
But
I'm still troubled about the Gerald Ford question, because the first one who tried to do something about stopping the Watergate investigations was Gerald Ford when the first investigation started in the House.
how else do you think he became vice president, Jim?
Well, that's going to be my bottom line question. Do you think that there was a quid pro quo,
No.
that there was a deal somewhere along the line? I know that many people who've looked at it, including the board of directors of the Profiles in Courage Award, which awarded that honor to Gerald Ford, came out and decided that what you said should win the day, that he helped the country avoid a protracted fight. But do you
Okay.
think there may be more that we don't know?
I don't think so, Jim. The question is, was there a deal? And it was very, very much a question when Ford pardoned Nixon. Had they made a quid pro quo? And there were investigations of it. Nobody has found anything. And Ford, as president, had to go up to the Hill. Was it before your subcommittee, to testify on what had happened? Jerry Ford was picked, I believe. A lot of people were nominating themselves because they saw there was a good opening there, likely, because he was safe. He was good old Jerry. He hadn't been a big critic of Nixon, but everybody thought of him, and I think this turned out to be true, as a decent guy, decent man, good old Midwesterner from Michigan. I'm an Ohioan, so I have a partiality for Midwesterners. And he was safe, but he was no sparkling figure. And I described the scene in here in the White House when Nixon is going to announce who is going to be his vice president after they got rid of Agnew for accepting cash envelopes in the vice presidential office, in the executive office building from some contractors in Maryland. I mean, it was like that. So Agnew was out. And I remember I described the scene there is Nixon is talking and he's sort of building it up, and people stand up and applaud. And I thought there has to be some mistake here. Jerry Ford isn't standing up. He must be confused. And sure enough, it was Jerry Ford. I mean, he was no star, but he turned out to be, I think, just right for this. He was steady. He set the right tone. I think the pardon was right to say, now let's put this behind us and keep going. There was a big discussion, big argument with the new prosecutor, Jaworski, and so on, as to whether or not Nixon should be prosecuted. I don't know what would have been gained by that. I don't know how the man could have been shamed anymore. And he would have written another book, I guess. He did, actually, when he was at San Clemente, but as impeachment was closing in on him, and of course we all thought of a certain name that's thrown around too much, he said some of the greatest books have been written from jails, referring, of course, to Mein Kampf. But no, I don't think there was anything there, anything untoward there. We done?
Not quite.
There's a question there.
Do you have a question?
I just had one question. I wondered, my name is Annie Koch. I just wondered if you had a nutshell theory on why Nixon was so paranoid. I mean, is there such a thing?
Well, the question, did I have a nutshell theory why I was so paranoid? I stayed away from psychobabble here, and you really can't get into somebody's head. It just began very early. Very early, he felt that people were looking down on him, and he was resentful. He wasn't surrounded by a lot of love. His father was very vituperative, and he kept failing at various business. And the mother, whom he kept calling a saint, I'm not sure why, because she was very cold, and it was very difficult for him to win her approval. Even after he became president, I think she finally said something nice. And he had two brothers who were tubercular and who died, and she was focusing on them. So this just, who knows what happens in people's heads, but he just grew up resenting, and he didn't know when to stop. There's a wonderful little soliloquy that he did after he got to San Clemente that I have in the afterward about how it starts out as a piece of cake. You work out your resentments, and it's so easy, and then you get carried away and you realize, you don't need to stop, but you should have stopped. Anyway, he did it much better than I'm doing. So no, I don't know why. It was just so clearly there. He was very, very bigoted, and this came out in the tapes. This affected things. I went back and read my conversations with members of Congress on what they wanted to do about impeaching him or not. This was a scary project. But the language on the tapes, they said we heard that LBJ had kind of bad language, but he was a piker compared to Nixon. And there was this sort of crudeness that went on, and this hatred of blacks and Jews, and the Jews are all psychiatrists, and the blacks are just down from the trees, and things like that. And the language was not fit to repeat. So it was just in him from a very early age, and he got away with punishing people he thought were his enemies, getting him off of tickets, elbowing him away from being his rivals, and he just didn't know when to stop.
I'm going to get the last question. But first, a story. Many of you will remember a fellow by the name of Harold Carswell, who was an appointee to the Supreme Court who was rejected because Roman Orusca said mediocrity is entitled to representation on the court. And a fellow by the name of Richard Harris wrote wrote 3 articles for the New Yorker and turned into a book. And it was sort of a case study of how Carswell was defeated. Everyone mentioned in that book, and every organization mentioned in that book who opposed Carswell was audited on their tax returns. That was under Richard Nixon and John Connally as the Secretary of the Treasury. And that's indeed what happened. And some of those organizations, their tax-exempt status was threatened, and so it's a live example of how we move to vendetta and enemies, and distinguishing between opponents and enemies. Now, my question, Elizabeth, is: this was also a remarkable period of people rising to great public service and going well beyond what was expected of them. People in the Congress, people in the staffs of the Congress. Share a little bit about that with us, because people ought to know there is such a thing as public service, and there is such a thing as outstanding public servants.
And you don't know where it's going to come from. Right. I dedicated this version of the book to those who rose to the occasion. The publishers, I guess to save a page or so, put it on the copyright page, so you'd have to struggle to find it. But that was, thank you, David, because that was one of the most important things that happened here. Now, there was a lot of fuss made over the Ervin committee hearings because Sam Ervin he talked Constitution a lot, but he was a bit of a ham. And so it was a great show, and he did show the country this parade of bizarre people who were populating the White House or running around doing deeds for them, or deep sixing material in the Potomac River. Somebody told him to deep six some material that had been found. All these bizarre things. But it was when it got to the House that it got very serious and very, very important. And there was a relatively new chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, Peter Rodino. Now, he was from Newark, so the press and cliches being what they were, everybody said, oh, Rodino, he must be mobbed up. But nobody could find anything. He was a very quiet man, modest, and he set the tone. He hired somebody who was 27 at the time. He can't be here tonight, Francis O'Brien. He was just this very bright guy. I don't know really how they found each other. Francis at the time lied about his age. He said he was 34. He was really kind of the brains behind this thing. Francis and his brother had to find a council. There was a very sort of partisan, where are you, David? Right to nod your head? Yeah. Okay. A very partisan staff left over from Manny Seller, who had been defeated. And Rodino understood this had to be seen as non-partisan, as really fair. So Francis and his brother, John, I don't know if he has very funny stories about this, but he went out and they found the counsel for the committee in John Doerr, who had been in the Eisenhower Justice Department and then in the Bobby Kennedy Justice Department is working on civil rights. He was a real hero, but nobody could call John Doerr a flamethrower or a partisan figure. And they understood that this had to come from the center. It had to be bipartisan for the country to accept it. And that's why the Vietnam War, the invasion of Cambodia, other things that had been suggested to be part of the impeachment proceedings were set aside. And they had as much trouble pushing aside the lefties who wanted to go into all sorts of issues and the people on the far right who could find no wrong with Nixon. And then you had these members that you really didn't know about. There was a man, Caldwell Butler was one, but from Virginia, or from South Carolina, you know who I mean. Anyway, we'll come up with James Mann. James Mann looked like a founding father. I mean, we imputed to them. We thought they were all, James Madison, and they were very, very serious. Now, James Mann was a real conservative on the Democratic side, Southern Democrat, dyed in the wool, member Southern Democrats. And Mann was very, very involved in this. There was Paul Sarbanes from Baltimore, who was very involved in shaping Article 2, and they worked together. And there were Republicans, Caldwell Butler. There was Hogan also from Maryland, Larry Hogan, also from Maryland. And Tom Railsback. I mean, these were we saw them as beforehand, we saw them as average figures, House members. Nobody had done anything very outstanding. Rodino was this very plain-spoken, not terribly eloquent man. And they all rose. And they took it very seriously, and we took them very seriously, and they reached this bipartisan agreement that the country accepted. Now, I can tell you afterward, I had dinner with one of these heroes to clear up some questions for the book, and he invited me to this cocktail party on the Hill, and it was a lobbyist party. And he started telling me stories about how people really wanted to get on the Judiciary Committee because there were such wonderful trips you could take all over the world to, and some of the stuff that went on that would not be fit to print. And so this all just proved to me they were real normal people who, when the occasion came, they really rose to it. This was true of the staff. It was a very complicated thing to keep under control. I don't know if any of you remember seeing in your mind's eye that committee, watching it on television. You may not remember, you didn't see any cameras because Francis O'Brien got the idea. He didn't want people to think he wanted the people to be right in there with the committee. So he said to the mighty brass of the network, you want to cover it? You're going to do it through a hole in the wall. You're not going to be in the room. Now, it was things like that most people, don't think of. But mainly it was the character that came out. They all knew the gravity, and the book will show you. I was talking to a lot of these members who truly couldn't make up their mind, but they talked to me because the deal was I wasn't going to write about it until afterwards, and they were very serious. What is a crime? What is a high crime? What is a misdemeanor? What does that mean? Is it just, they have to have burglarized something, or is it beyond that? What is accountability? This is a very, very serious set of questions. And I don't know if it was sort of a model impeachment. The stuff that goes on now, and of course it got ruined when Gingrich ran that impeachment against Bill Clinton for ostensibly lying under oath, but we all know what it was. And it's really too bad that this thing has gotten out of control and used so loosely, because it was very grave, and it was public servants, regular people, not stars, and they made it happen, and they held the country together while they did it. Is that what you wanted to know?
Yeah, that's just what I wanted to know. It is. Thank you, Elizabeth.